In the dark corners of the mind, a terrifying force lurks, waiting for the right moment to strike. One family, one night, and a nightmare so twisted, it will haunt you forever. Prepare yourself for a chilling descent into madness as we unravel the horrific tale of the Harok family massacre. Stay with us until the end, because you won't believe how it all ends. The room was suffocating. The air felt heavy, like it hadn't moved in days. A faint hum of the refrigerator broke the silence, steady and unnerving. The kitchen table stood in the center, its surface cluttered with untouched cups and an open notebook. A red smear stretched across its corner, faint but undeniable. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly, each second clawing at the nerves. Jakub Harok sat motionless, his hand trembling over the notebook. His pen hovered, its tip pressing into the paper, forming a small black pool. His breath came in shallow bursts, barely audible. The window behind him was open, letting in the brisk air of the Brno night. But no sound from the streets. No voices. No footsteps. Just the hollow ticking and that dreadful hum. The smell hit him first.
Coppery. Thick.
His throat tightened as he turned toward the hallway. The light bulb above flickered, casting distorted shadows on the walls. Jakub's legs felt like lead as he stood, his bare feet pressing into the cold floor. The door to his parents' bedroom was ajar, the faintest sliver of darkness visible through the crack. He moved forward, the floorboards creaking beneath him. The sound echoed, louder than it should have been, like the house itself was holding its breath. His hand reached out, fingers grazing the door's edge. He pushed it open. The scene was chaos. Sheets tangled, stained with something too dark to be wine. The metallic scent grew stronger, almost unbearable. A figure lay sprawled on the bed, motionless. His father's face was turned away, his arm hanging limply over the side. Jakub's chest tightened, his heart thundering in his ears. He wanted to scream, to turn and run, but his body betrayed him. Something shifted in the corner of the room. A faint scrape, like metal against wood. Jakub froze, his eyes darting toward the sound. The shadows moved, alive, unnatural. And then he saw it. A hand. Not his father's. Thin, pale fingers curling around the edge of the closet door. It slid open, inch by inch, the faint creak slicing through the silence. Jakub's breath hitched, his pulse pounding in his temples. The closet revealed nothing at first. Just clothes. Hangers swaying slightly, as though disturbed by a breath of air. And then, from the darkness, eyes. Wide, unblinking. Too white against the gloom. The figure stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Bare feet touched the floor with eerie softness, leaving faint smudges on the wooden planks. A face emerged, gaunt, pale as porcelain, framed by hair matted with dark streaks. The metallic smell thickened, clinging to Jakub's throat like smoke. The figure's lips curled into something that wasn't a smile. Its head tilted, unnaturally sharp, as if curious. Jakub's legs trembled, but he couldn't move. The figure held something in its hand.
A knife.
Its blade glinted in the faint light, smeared with something sticky and red. Jakub's stomach churned, ball rising as his gaze locked onto the weapon. The figure took another step, and then another. The space between them shrank, each moment stretching into eternity. Jakub's back pressed against the wall, his fingers clawing at the cold plaster. His voice caught in his throat, unable to form words. The figure stopped, inches away, its breath cold against his skin. It raised the knife, the movement slow, deliberate. Jakub's instincts finally kicked in. He lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the blade as it sliced through the air. The sound of it hitting the wall behind him was deafening. He stumbled into the hallway, his feet slipping on the slick floor. He didn't look back.
Couldn't.
The figure's footsteps followed, deliberate, unhurried. Jakub reached the front door, his hands fumbling with the lock. Sweat slicked his palms, making the metal slippery. Behind him, the footsteps stopped. The hum of the refrigerator grew louder, a low growl vibrating through the air. And then a whisper.
Soft.
Barely audible. His name. Jakob froze. The whisper was thin, rasping, but unmistakable. His name drawn out like a taunt. Ja-Cub. The lock finally clicked. He yanked the door open, the wood groaning against the frame. Cold air from the stairwell rushed in, biting his sweat-soaked skin. He bolted through, slamming the door shut behind him. His bare feet pounded against the concrete stairs as he descended. Each step echoed, reverberating up the stairwell like a distorted heartbeat.
He didn't stop.
Not to look back, not to think. The sound of his own breath was deafening, ragged gasps tearing through the silence. Halfway down, he heard it again, the whisper. But now it wasn't coming from above. It was below. Jakob. The voice was closer, clearer, carrying a sickly sweetness. His steps faltered. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting jagged shadows along the walls. He looked down the stairwell, and his heart dropped. At the base of the stairs stood the figure.
Still.
Motionless. Its face tilted upward, those same unblinking eyes fixed on him. The knife dangled from its hand, dripping something dark onto the floor. It didn't move, didn't speak, but Jakob could feel its gaze, sharp and unrelenting. He stumbled back a step, his hand gripping the railing so hard it hurt. The hum returned, vibrating through the air, louder now, like it was emanating from the very walls. The figure took a step forward, then another. Each movement was deliberate, as though savoring the moment. Jakob's back hit the wall. Trapped between the figure below and the door above, his mind raced. His chest heaved as panic clawed at him. Then he heard it again. Not a whisper this time. A sound from above. The creak of the door opening.
Slowly.
Jakob's eyes darted upward. And there, at the top of the stairs, was another figure. Identical. Knife in hand, eyes wide, unblinking. Jakob, it whispered. The walls felt like they were closing in. The hum became a roar. And Jakob screamed. The scream tore from his throat, raw and desperate, echoing endlessly in the stairwell. Both figures moved now. The one above descended, one deliberate step at a time. The one below climbed, its movements a mirror of the other. Jakob's knees buckled, his back pressed flat against the cold wall. His gaze darted between them, panic coursing through his veins like fire. The air grew colder, sharp and biting, each breath a struggle. The hum transformed into something worse. A low, guttural drone, vibrating through the concrete, rattling his very bones. It felt alive. Jakob's shaking hands fumbled for the railing. He gripped it, his knuckles turning white, and forced himself to move. Upward, toward the figure descending from above. Toward the only door he knew might lead to safety. The stairs seemed endless, stretching unnaturally with each step. The figure above moved faster now, its knife glinting in the flickering light. Its head tilted sharply, a grotesque, bird-like motion. Jakob. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was louder, filling the space, overlapping with itself.
Two voices now.
One above, one below, both calling his name. Jakob. The sound grated against his mind, clawing at his sanity. His legs burned, muscles screaming, but he kept climbing. The top figure lunged suddenly, closing the gap in a heartbeat. Jakob ducked instinctively, the knife slicing through the air above him. He stumbled past, nearly losing his footing. The figure's head twisted unnaturally, its eyes never leaving him. It let out a low, guttural laugh that sent ice through his veins. Jakob reached the door. He slammed his fist against it, praying it wasn't locked. His fingers scrabbled for the handle, twisting it with all his strength. The door gave way, swinging open into the icy night. He burst through, collapsing onto the pavement outside. The hum stopped. Silence. Deafening. Jakob turned back, expecting the figures to follow. But the doorway was empty.
Dark. Still.
The stairwell loomed like a gaping maw, silent but alive with menace. And then, from the shadows, a hand reached out. The hand was thin, bone-white, its fingers unnaturally long. It clawed at the edge of the doorway, scraping against the concrete with a sound that set Jakob's teeth on edge. He scrambled backward, the rough pavement biting into his palms. His breath clouded in the freezing air, chest heaving with terror. The hand pulled back, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. For a moment, there was nothing. No movement. No sound. Only the faint glow of the streetlights casting eerie shadows across the deserted street. Jakob's heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out the silence. His eyes locked onto the doorway, unblinking, waiting for something to emerge. The shadows shifted. Not from within the stairwell, but from the edges of the street. Jakob's head whipped around. The alleys. The windows of the neighboring buildings. All dark, yet alive with the faintest flicker of movement. Figures.
Dozens of them.
Their pale faces glimmered briefly in the dim light, disappearing just as quickly. They stood motionless at first, barely visible, like wraiths on the edge of reality. But then they stepped forward, one by one into the street, each figure identical to the ones Jakob had seen inside.
Gaunt.
Wide, unblinking eyes. Knives hanging limply at their sides. Jakob staggered to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He turned to run, but the sound stopped him cold. It started low, like a distant murmur. A voice, no, voices. All whispering in unison. Jakob. His name, over and over, filling the empty street like a malevolent chant. The figures moved closer, their steps synchronized, the sound of their bare feet scraping against the pavement. Jakob's instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. His knees buckled again, and he dropped to the ground. The whispers grew louder, merging into a deafening roar. The figures closed in, encircling him. Knives raised, glinting in the faint light, their movements impossibly slow, deliberate. And then, just as the first blade descended, everything went black. The darkness was complete. Jakob floated in it, weightless, suspended in an abyss where time and space ceased to exist. His ears rang, the echoes of the chanting fading into an oppressive silence. No ground beneath him, no air to breathe. He reached out blindly, his hands grasping at nothing. Then came the sound, soft at first like a heartbeat. Thump, thump. It grew louder, reverberating through the void, shaking the very fabric of whatever place he had been dragged into. A flicker of light appeared in the distance.
Dim.
Faintly red. It pulsed in time with the sound, each throb illuminating fragments of the space around him. Walls began to take shape, their surfaces slick and glistening, as though alive. Jakob realized he was no longer floating. His feet touched something wet and sticky. He looked down, his stomach lurching. The ground was a mass of dark, pulsating flesh, veins twisting like roots beneath his feet. The air was thick, suffused with the sickly sweet stench of decay. He tried to move, but his feet sank into the fleshy surface, holding him in place. The red light grew brighter, the pulsating walls quivering with every beat. And then he heard it again. Jakob. The voice came from everywhere at once, surrounding him, invading his mind. It wasn't just a voice, it was hundreds, layered and distorted, a cacophony of malice. He turned wildly, searching for the source. Shapes began to emerge from the walls, human-like but grotesquely twisted. Faces stretched unnaturally long, mouths agape in silent screams. Eyes wide, unblinking, their gaze fixed on him. From the darkness, a figure stepped forward. larger than the others, its presence suffocating. Its face was obscured, a swirling void where features should have been. But the knife in its hand was unmistakable. The blade glinted in the pulsing red light, dripping with something black and viscous. Jakob struggled against the ground, his body thrashing, but it held him fast. The figure approached, slow and methodical, each step sinking into the fleshy ground with a sickening squelch. It stopped mere inches from him, the knife poised above his chest. Jakob's voice finally returned, a choked, desperate plea.
Why?
What do you want? The figure leaned in, its void-like face inches from his own. The whisper stopped. Silence hung heavy, crushing, before the answer came. A single, guttural word, spoken in a voice that made his blood run cold. Everything. The knife plunged down. The pain was instant and all-consuming. A white-hot flash seared through Jakob's chest, radiating outward like fire. He screamed. The sound ripped from his throat, raw and primal. The figure didn't flinch. Its grip on the knife was unrelenting, the blade twisting deeper. The fleshy ground beneath Jakob quivered, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. The walls around him writhed, their slick surfaces peeling back to reveal more faces. Dozens.
Hundreds.
All staring. Mouths open in grotesque unison, as if silently feeding on his agony. The red light flared, bathing the scene in a blood-soaked glow. Jakob's vision blurred, his body convulsing against the relentless grip of the living floor. And then, the whispers returned. Louder now. More frenzied. Everything. 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 They drilled into his mind, each word a jagged shard that splintered his thoughts. The figure above him pulled the knife free, its blade glistening black in the pulsing light. Jakob gasped, choking on air that tasted of iron and rot. The wound on his chest didn't bleed. Instead, something darker oozed from it, thick and alive, tendrils spreading across his skin. The substance crawled upward, wrapping around his neck, his arms, pulling him deeper into the pulsating ground. He clawed at it, his nails tearing into his own flesh, but it was no use. The tendrils tightened, dragging him down inch by inch. Above him, the figure tilted its head, watching.
Silent.
The knife lowered again, but this time it didn't strike. Instead, it pointed. Jakob followed its direction, his head turning sluggishly. In the distance, where the red light was brightest, something shifted. A massive shadow, colossal and incomprehensible, began to take form.
Eyes.
Dozens of them, blinking in and out of existence, scattered across the writhing shadow. They locked onto Jakob, pinning him with their gaze. A mouth stretched wide, impossibly large, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It spoke without moving, its voice thunderous and final. You are mine. The tendrils yanked him downward, and the world above vanished into blackness. Jakob fell into the abyss, his body weightless yet dragged by an invisible force. The darkness consumed him, suffocating and endless. No ground, no walls, no sense of direction. Only the overwhelming pull, dragging him deeper into the void. His chest burned where the knife had struck, the tendrils now embedded in his skin, pulsating like a second heartbeat. The voice returned, louder, reverberating through his mind. You will give me what I seek. Jakob's voice cracked as he screamed into the emptiness, his desperation clawing at the silence. Why me? What do you want from me? The void responded with laughter. Low, guttural, and echoing with malice. The sound vibrated through his bones, a terrible symphony of torment. Ahead, a faint light emerged, a sickly green glow that grew brighter as he plummeted toward it. Shapes began to form within the light, shifting and writhing like shadows trapped behind a veil. The pulse slowed, and Jakob's feet found solid ground again. But it wasn't relief, it was worse. The surface was alive, undulating beneath him, a grotesque landscape of flesh and bone. He stood in a twisted amphitheater, the walls made of interlocking bodies, faces frozen in silent agony. Above, the sky was an endless swirl of black and green, punctuated by those same countless eyes. They blinked in unison, focused entirely on him. At the center of the arena, a throne rose from the ground, formed from the same pulsating material. Seated upon it was something that defied reason. Its body was a mass of shifting forms, part human, part beast, with limbs that twisted and merged as it moved. Its face was ever-changing, cycling through familiar features, his father, his mother, his own reflection, before settling on the void-like visage he had seen before. The figure raised a hand, its spindly fingers pointing directly at him. "You are the seed," it said, its voice a cacophony of tones. Jakob shook his head, backing away, his heart racing. "No, I don't understand. Let me go." The ground beneath him quaked, tendrils rising up to hold him in place. "You are mine," it repeated, the voices growing louder, their weight unbearable. Jakob's vision blurred, tears streaming down his face as he struggled against the living chains. The figure on the throne leaned forward, its many faces splitting into twisted grins. "You will feed the cycle. You will be the harbinger." The tendrils surged upward, wrapping around his throat, his limbs, dragging him closer to the throne. Jakob screamed, his voice lost in the roar of the void. And then, from somewhere deep inside him, a memory flickered. His mother's voice, soft and warm. "Fight, Jakob. Don't let it take you." The words ignited something within him, a spark of resistance. His body jerked against the tendrils, muscles straining with renewed strength. The entity on the throne roared, its many faces contorting in fury. The tendrils recoiled slightly, their grip faltering. Jakob clawed at them, tearing at the dark, pulsating mass as the light around him began to shift. The green glow dimmed, replaced by flashes of something brighter, golden and warm. The void trembled, the walls of the arena beginning to collapse. "You cannot escape," the entity bellowed, its form unraveling, limbs stretching and disintegrating into the abyss. Jakob felt the pull again, but this time it was different. It wasn't dragging him deeper, it was pulling him up, toward the golden light. He reached for it, his hand outstretched, as the ground beneath him crumbled. The voices screamed, fading into nothingness. The light engulfed him, blinding and pure. And then silence. Jakob awoke with a gasp. His lungs burned as he drew in the cold, crisp air. The sharp tang of pine and damp earth filled his senses. He was lying on his back in the middle of a forest, the canopy above swaying gently in the wind. The golden light filtered through the leaves, warm and serene, a stark contrast to the nightmare he had just endured. His fingers dug into the soft soil beneath him, grounding him, assuring him this wasn't some new torment. The whispers were gone, the hum gone, but the wound on his chest remained. Jakob sat up slowly, his body aching, his head pounding. He looked down at himself, his shirt torn and stained with dark streaks. His chest bore no blood, only a strange mark, a twisting pattern of black veins radiating outward from the spot where the knife had pierced him. The sight of it sent a shiver through him. He reached out to touch it, but the moment his fingers brushed the skin, a jolt of cold shot through his body. Memories flooded back. The stairwell, the figures, the throne, the entity. Jakob scrambled to his feet, his breath shallow and rapid. He turned in every direction, scanning the forest for signs of danger. But there was nothing. No figures lurking in the shadows. No malevolent presence. Just the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of birds. It felt wrong. Too peaceful, too perfect, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Jakob's legs trembled as he took a step forward, then another, the soft crunch of leaves beneath his feet grounding him. The trees seemed endless, their trunks stretching upward like sentinels. The deeper he walked, the more disoriented he became. There were no paths, no signs of civilization, only the quiet hum of the forest, faint but ever-present. And then a sound. Soft, almost imperceptible, a whisper. Jakob froze, his heart skipping a beat. It wasn't like before. This whisper was faint, fragmented, carried on the breeze. Not his name, but a plea. Help me. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the trees. There was no one. The whisper came again, clearer this time, pulling him deeper into the forest. Against his better judgment, he followed. Each step felt heavier, the air growing colder, the light dimmer. The trees around him began to change, their bark gnarled and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. The hum returned, low and steady, vibrating through the ground. Jakob's breathing quickened as he broke into a run, chasing the voice that seemed to grow closer and yet farther away, until he saw it, a clearing up ahead, bathed in a pale, silvery light. In the center stood a figure.
Small.
Fragile. A child. Her back was to him, her head bowed, her arms limp at her sides. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice trembling. Jakob hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But something about her kept him rooted to the spot. She turned slowly, her face hidden by the shadows. And then, she stepped into the light. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, just like theirs. "Help me, Jakob," she said, her lips curling into an unnatural smile. Jakob's blood ran cold. The voice was wrong, too wrong. Her smile stretched too wide, her eyes too vacant. The shadows beneath her seemed to ripple and pulse, as though alive. The air thickened around him, the hum growing louder, almost deafening. His body froze, his heart pounding in his chest as the figure took a step toward him. With each movement, the ground seemed to warp beneath her feet, the earth itself contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Her form wavered, flickering like a broken reflection in water. "Help me," she whispered again, but now the voice was distorted, layered with 1,000 others, all echoing in unison. Jakob stumbled back, his legs refusing to obey, his breath shallow and erratic. The girl's figure blurred for a moment, then became clear again. Closer, much closer. Jakob could see the tendrils, thick and dark, curling up from her feet, wrapping around her legs like snakes. Her hands, though delicate in appearance, were now twisted, fingers stretching unnaturally, reaching for him. She was no child, no innocent. This was something far worse, something waiting to be unleashed. The sky above darkened, the once peaceful canopy now a swirling mass of storm clouds, crackling with unnatural energy. The hum intensified, vibrating the very ground beneath him. "Help me, Jakob." The voice was no longer a plea. It was a command. The girl's smile widened even further, her lips parting to reveal sharp, jagged teeth, teeth that seemed far too large for her small face. Her fingers twitched, and the tendrils at her feet surged forward, extending toward him, each one wrapped in an oily, black mist. Jakob couldn't move. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The mist reached him, wrapping around his legs, his arms, pulling him toward her. He fought against it, struggling, but the tendrils tightened with each movement, dragging him closer to the girl's outstretched hands. "Join us." The voice wasn't just in his ears. It was inside his head, crawling through his thoughts, weaving itself into every corner of his mind. The girl's face began to change again, her features twisting and distorting, becoming an amalgamation of all the faces Jakob had seen before, the unblinking eyes, the mouths wide in silent screams. The air grew frigid, each breath now a struggle, the frost beginning to creep across his skin. The ground beneath him cracked open, revealing the black abyss below. Everything will be yours. The words echoed inside his mind, louder now, filling every inch of his consciousness. Jakob's pulse quickened. His entire body screamed for him to escape. But the tendrils held him fast, pulling him down, closer to the abyss. And then, as his feet finally broke the surface, disappearing into the inky darkness below, the world around him shattered. The hum stopped. The storm vanished. The forest dissolved into nothing. And Jakob, his body, his soul, was swallowed by the void. For a moment there was nothing. No light. No sound. Just an overwhelming, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on for eternity. Jakob's mind flickered, desperately searching for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. His thoughts felt fragmented, as though they were being torn apart, scattered across an endless void. Then, a shape began to form in the distance, a faint outline through the blackness. At first, it was small, just a speck of light, but it grew larger with every passing second. A flicker of hope?
No.
The light wasn't comforting. It was blinding. A burning, searing white that threatened to consume him whole. Jakob's chest constricted, his heart hammering in his ribs as the light drew nearer. He wanted to run, to escape, but his body was paralyzed, his limbs refusing to respond. The light enveloped him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt something again.
Pain.
Excruciating, unrelenting pain. It shot through him like 1,000 daggers, each one searing deeper than the last. His skin felt like it was being ripped from his bones, his blood boiling in his veins. He gasped, his mouth dry, as the light became unbearable, pressing against him from all sides. He could barely breathe, could barely think, trapped in this all-consuming blaze. And then, just as the pain reached its peak, everything stopped. The light vanished. The pain receded, and Jakob found himself standing, no longer floating, no longer falling. He was on solid ground. The landscape around him was unfamiliar, but it felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. The sky above was a sickly shade of purple, streaked with veins of red, like the last remnants of a dying sunset. The ground beneath his feet was cracked, blackened, as if burned by an unseen force. And the air was thick, stifling. It clung to his skin like oil, and the smell was rancid, like something long dead and forgotten. He could hear a faint echo of something in the distance, something that sounded like a child crying. Jakob's heart clenched, his body moving before his mind could catch up. He staggered forward, stumbling over the uneven ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. With each step, the sound of the crying grew louder, more urgent, more desperate. His legs burned, his chest tight, but he kept moving. He had to. He had to help. The cry was louder now, almost deafening, but there was something off about it. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was something darker, something twisted. Jakob's pulse quickened. He reached the edge of the clearing, where the sound seemed to be coming from. There, lying in the center of a patch of blackened grass, was a figure.
A child.
Her back was to him, her tiny shoulders trembling with each cry. Her hair, long and dark, fell in tangled strands around her face. "Please," the voice choked out. "Help me." Jakob's hand reached out, but before his fingers could touch her, she turned. And for the first time since he had entered this nightmare, Jakob felt true, unrelenting terror. Her face was a mask of distortion, her eyes wide and empty. Her mouth, too wide, split into a grotesque grin. The words she spoke were no longer a plea, but a command. "Join us, Jakob." The ground beneath him began to tremble, and the world around him shifted once again. Jakob could feel the pull, the same pull that had once dragged him down into the abyss. He tried to fight it, but it was too late. The ground trembled beneath Jakob's feet, the air thickening with an unbearable weight. The child's twisted grin widened, stretching too far, her face elongating in ways that defied all logic. Her eyes remained fixed on him, hollow and dark, as the ground around her began to crack, opening wide to reveal a void that seemed to go on forever. Jakob's heart pounded in his chest, his breath ragged as the dark pull grew stronger. The world around him warped, the colors fading to dull shades of gray, the once blinding sky now nothing but a swirling, oppressive darkness. "No!" Jakob screamed, his voice hoarse, his body refusing to move. But it was futile. The pull was too powerful, an unrelenting force that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The child's voice echoed again, louder this time, like a chorus of distorted whispers. "Join us." Jakob struggled, his hands gripping the cracked earth, his nails scraping against the broken surface, but the tendrils of the abyss were already closing in around him. He tried to run, tried to escape, but his legs wouldn't obey. Each step felt like he was sinking deeper into the ground, his feet becoming trapped in the blackened earth. The child's eyes seemed to grow even darker, the void within them pulling at his very soul. He could feel himself slipping, his body drawn toward the abyss. His mind screamed, but no words came, only the oppressive pull. The child's distorted voice filled the air once more, but now it was joined by a chorus of others, faces from his past, distorted and hollow, all calling out to him, beckoning him toward the darkness. "Jakob, come to us. Everything is yours." The whispers blended into one maddening roar, all-consuming, all-powerful. Jakob's chest tightened as he felt himself falling through the void, through the darkness that had claimed him. He tried to fight it, but his strength was slipping away. The abyss was too strong, and the child's laughter echoed in his mind as the last traces of light faded into nothingness. And then there was silence. Complete and utter silence. The void had claimed him, and Jakob was no more. The silence was suffocating. Jakob's senses faded into nothingness, the last remnants of his consciousness unraveling. He felt himself floating in an infinite emptiness, the weight of it pressing against him, making him feel small, insignificant. For what seemed like an eternity, there was no sound, no light, just a vast, oppressive void. But then something shifted. A pulse, a faint vibration, like a heartbeat, reverberated through the darkness. At first, it was barely noticeable, like the smallest of ripples in a calm sea. But then it grew stronger, faster, until it became impossible to ignore. The pulse turned into a rhythm, a steady beat, like the thumping of a drum in the distance. Jakob felt the rhythm in his bones, in his very soul, as though the beat was calling to him. He couldn't explain it, but a spark of recognition flared within him. A connection. He wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was with him in this endless expanse. And then, the first glimmer of light appeared. It was distant at first, just a tiny speck of illumination against the vast blackness. But the light grew, expanding, filling the void with warmth and clarity. Jakob's breath caught in his throat as the light revealed a shape, an outline that he could barely comprehend. It was a figure, tall, almost regal in its presence, with eyes that shimmered with the same light that now surrounded him. The figure stepped forward, its presence radiating calm, a contrast to the chaos Jakob had experienced. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jakob felt no fear, no pain. The figure reached out, its hand gentle and steady, offering Jakob something he had long forgotten, the possibility of peace. "You're not alone," the figure spoke, its voice soft but clear, as though it came from deep within him. The words echoed through the expanse, reverberating like a final truth. Jakob's heart stopped its frantic beating, and in its place, there was only an overwhelming sense of serenity. He took the figure's hand, feeling the warmth flood through him, erasing the cold, the fear, the darkness. And as the light enveloped him completely, Jakob let go of everything. He didn't need to fight anymore. The journey had come to an end.